we will audit your loan file. And we'll let you know if there's something wrong in your loan file so that maybe you can try to stop or postpone the foreclosure sale on your own. So we're not acting as a foreclosure consultant. So we can collect all the upfront fees that we want, and we don't have to register with the Department of Justice. And then we can collect upfront fees and do nothing for you. So starting January 1st, anyone who does a foreclosure audit or a loan audit is deemed to be a foreclosure consultant. Now, by the way, how does any of this impact you? Well, the fact of the matter is, you take a short sale listing, maybe you're trying to help somebody avoid a foreclosure. But if you are doing that in conjunction with your normal real estate licensed activity, you are not a foreclosure consultant. So as long as you're doing this in association with regular licensed activity, you don't have to worry about that one. Mortgage loan origination. Do we have anyone here who does loan origination?
No.
We're going to skip. There's one, so we're going to skip. We're going to go on to lead paint remediation. What's happening with lead paint remediation? Well, a couple of things. Starting in April of this year, if you're a lead paint renovator or contractor, and you're going to be doing work in any residential property, or other property where children are present, like a daycare center. There's basically a few things that you had to do. You had to be certified, you had to follow certain lead-safe practices, you have to give out a booklet to the homeowner. In order to get certified, you had to go to certain classes. These are rules that are required by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. So what was happening? The EPA found out nobody was getting certified. So they said, well, we'll extend the deadline to get certified until October of this year. They weren't extending any of the other rules, just extending until October of this year the certification requirement. And they said, as long as you've signed up for a class by October of this year and you complete it by December of this year, we'll deem that you've satisfied that element of the law. Well, it's past October of this year. So if we have a contractor or a renovator, and what does it mean? How much work does it have to do? If you're removing more than 6 square feet interior, or 20 square feet exterior, or if you're doing any work at all on windowsills, you've got to comply with these rules. So something that we did in association with this, with the CAR forms release that just happened a few weeks ago in the end of November, is we have a new question on our seller property questionnaire, which I hope you're using, that asks the seller if they had any work done, was it done by somebody who was certified? Okay. We have a new paragraph in the statewide buyer and seller advisor, the SBSA form, that discusses this. We've added language to the federal lead disclosure form, a 2-page form for pre-78 properties that talks about this renovation requirement. So hopefully that information will get out to the public of what's required. Next subject, carbon monoxide detector. I like this subject. What do we know about carbon monoxide? Well, it's a bad thing. And the state says it's a bad thing. And in the introductory remarks to the legislation, they talk about how many people die every year because of carbon monoxide poisoning. So starting July 1st of next year, for all single-family residential properties, attached or detached, there has to be an operable carbon monoxide detector. Now, does that mean it's like smoke detectors? They have to be one outside each bedroom and this and that? Well, we don't really know, and it's really going to be up to the local building department to tell you where they have to be. But starting July 1st, it's not a point of sale requirement, but there has to be an operable carbon monoxide detector in all single-family residential dwellings. Then starting July 1st of 2013, there has to be operable carbon monoxide detector in all dwellings, single family or not. Now there's an I was looking through the law and I found there was an interesting exception to this law. Now it applies to all dwellings, right? So, which would include dorm rooms, for example. And the obligation is on the owner to have the operable carbon monoxide detector. But there's an exception for regents of the University of California. So I was thinking about this. I was giving a speech recently. I was giving a speech and it was
people at the state level.
Yeah, you know what? That's why I don't want the public paying for your education.
That's what you want.
Get that right.
So I was giving a speech and I it was near a school, but it was a Cal State school. So I said, think of it, you know, bad news, you didn't get into a UC school. Good news, you're less likely to die of carbon monoxide poisoning when you're in your dorm room. Okay. So anyways, we got this law. You have to have operable smoke detectors. It's not a point of sale requirement, but we know that's when these things tend to wind up getting enforced. So the real estate transfer disclosure statement was amended by statute. That's actually in your packet. The real estate transfer disclosure statement is in there. And you'll see a couple of things in there, and they happen to be highlighted in red. In section 2A, the seller's information, there's a checkbox. Do you have carbon monoxide devices? And then you flip over the page and you see this long paragraph that's all in red. And it says, well, just because we have something doesn't mean it complies with the law. And I'm going to tell you something else that just happened to go along at the same time, even though it has nothing to do with carbon monoxide. And if you go further down to the bottom of page 2 on the transfer disclosure statement, you see there's this new section, D1 and 2, and this form is out now. It was released in January. Oh, thank you for showing that. And it's a seller certification for smoke detector and water heater. Has nothing to do with carbon monoxide. But as long as the TDS is being amended, your lobbyist said, why don't we put this into the transfer disclosure statement? So that if you're using a TDS in a transaction, you do not also need a separate smoke detector water heater statement of compliance. Okay. Well, we got some yays. I think it's time for me to end. Yep. I always end on a high note, you say. So those are two things that have been changed. Now there's a checkbox for carbon monoxide detectors, and the seller can certify smoke detector and water heater using the transfer disclosure statement. The next subject, home energy rating booklet. I like talking about this because it tells you, everybody knows the state's kind of in a dire situation right now, the state of California. Guess what? It's been that way for a while. This law kind of shows that. Home energy ratings booklet. So there's a new booklet dealing with what? Obviously, is the home energy efficient? Okay. And that booklet has been added to the combined hazards booklet. That's a booklet that has environmental hazards, lead paint, and the earthquake booklet. There's now 4 booklets there. Was released actually in October of this year. Do you know when the law came into effect that set out that there should be a home energy ratings booklet?
1980.
1980, not bad. A little bit off though. 96. So 14 years later,
Right.
we got the home energy rating booklet. Okay. Now, why do I mention that? I mention that because the carbon monoxide law that just passed said that there needs to be an addition to the already existing environmental hazards booklet to have a new chapter on carbon monoxide. So we're thinking, well, you know, maybe the next decade we'll get that new chapter. Okay. But the fact is, your colleagues thought that that was important enough that your realtor colleagues, your directors at CAR, authorized funding for the state agency to produce that chapter. And we anticipate that that chapter will be out early next year, in the first quarter of next year. So a few months as opposed to 14 years. We think that's probably a pretty good trade-off. Okay? So there's actually going to be another change to the environmental hazards booklet in the first quarter of next year when that carbon monoxide chapter comes out to amend the existing environmental hazards booklet. So those are my new laws. Let's talk about a couple of cases here that I thought were interesting that came out this year. The first one is the most recent one, the Holmes versus Summer case. The conclusion is not that dramatic. The conclusion is not really that surprising at all. It says a listing broker has a duty to disclose to a buyer if the seller needs lender approval for the transaction to close. Remember, you say, geez, what a surprise is that? I know you got a good office, you got a good broker here, good managers. You say, well, CAR has, well, we had something called a short sale listing, which has been replaced with something called the short sale information and advisory. And we have a short sale addendum. So if you use those forms, of course the disclosure is being made. Matter of fact, you're making the whole contract contingent upon lender approval. And let me tell you a little bit about how this case came about. Buyer entered into a contract with a seller to buy a property for $750,000. The property was encumbered by 3 different loans, totaling $1,190,000. Seller was a little bit short. No disclosure was made to the buyer. The buyer entered into the contract. The buyer did not have a contingency for the sale of their home, but the buyer then proceeded to sell their home. When did this contract take place? It took place in January of 2008. Okay. By the way, our forms came out in 2007. So our forms were available, they weren't used. Not in the case, but having talked to the lawyers in the case, the seller said to the broker, I'm going to come in with the money. Okay? I'm going to come in with the nearly, $400,000, whatever it is. The broker happened to know that the seller had just sold another property and had plenty of equity from that other property to make up the differential. So, of course, what happened? The seller did not come in with the money, did not get lender approval, and of course the sale did not close. The buyer turned around and said, I'm damaged. Okay? You should have told me about this. At trial, the trial court said, oh, who did the buyer sue? The buyer sued the listing agent. At trial, the trial court said, buyer, you have the wrong defendant. The seller breached the contract. The listing agent has no duty to you. The listing agent has a fiduciary duty to the seller. the amount that the seller owes on their loans is